It's the Tony Kinnett Cast on 93 WIPC.
Back to the Tony Kinnett Cast here on the Daily Signal, nationally syndicated, joined today by the one, the only Matt Sharp over from Alliance Defending Freedom. There's a lot of stuff that has to funnel into this election calculus, all right? There's a lot of people with a lot of different policies at the forefront, and something that was kind of a bigger deal, at least when we were discussing what people were and weren't in favor of back in kind of the early 2020s, was the idea of a lot of transgender law and a lot of, again, LGBTQ plus regarding children. And that is yet another place where Tim Walz appears really to have stepped in it. So, Matt, kind of give us an outline of what Tim Walz has to do with this whole transgender kids in the state situation.
Yeah, well, we really saw this sort of two pathways playing out in the states. On one hand, you had a group of now 26 states that have passed these good laws protecting kids from dangerous gender transition drugs and surgeries. We're seeing those going all the way to the Supreme Court, hopefully being upheld. But at the same time, we saw this parallel path, one that is much more dangerous for kids, coming out of places like Minnesota, like California, like Maine, where they're saying, come to the state, bring your kids here, and we're going to protect them. We're going to give them a right to these drugs and surgeries. And if someone in the home state, if let's say an aunt brings a child to Minnesota to get gender transition drugs and surgeries, and the parents back home in Georgia or wherever it may be say, this is wrong for our kid, we want them back, the Minnesota courts can take jurisdiction and custody away from those parents back in their home state. So we're seeing both an effort to protect kids in many states, but then these places like Minnesota and California trying to undermine parental rights and actually push kids further and further down this path towards these irreversible drugs and surgeries. And
it really is a wild idea that the state can, in a totally different state, can just assume control of your child. The idea that just because someone out there somewhere gets a kid some kind of a ticket to take them to one of these sanctuary states so they can be, well, quite honestly, experimented on is insane. It is insane that the Minnesota courts could assume control of a child within the state of Minnesota, but much less assume control and ownership of a child from a different state entirely just because the child crossed into their border. I mean, there's no way this can possibly be constitutional in how the states are supposed to interact with each other.
Well, that's right. There's always been an understanding that states respect other states' laws. If parents in Georgia have custody of their child, Minnesota doesn't step in and say, no, Georgia parents, we think you're doing it wrong. We're going to take your child away and place them with something else. But that's exactly what these laws do. It allows Minnesota, California, Massachusetts, these courts to say, we think you're doing it wrong by not giving your kids these irreversible drugs and surgeries. We're going to take custody. We're going to make sure the kids get those things, regardless of the growing body of evidence about the damage it does. And parents, we're going to push you away from this because we know better than you about how to raise your children. And that's dangerous. And you can see how this can trickle down into so many other areas where a state stepping in, taking parental authority away, undermining the decisions of those parents, and really pushing kids down these dangerous pathways.
And the reason that this functions into the calculus of the 2024 presidential election is specifically because when you look at Tim Walz and the legacy that he left through Minnesota, you see that him being a part of the White House team, him with Kamala and moving forward in this kind of policy poses a very severe threat to kids nationwide. And the reason I bring that up is because the executive branch is supposed to be one of the facilitating bodies between states and their relationships. And you see this through their appointment to the judiciary with the federal court system. You see this in their relationship with obviously signing laws and especially regulatory fiat through the government agencies. And this is a severe concern in, at least as far as I'm looking at Tim Walz's record. How is the Department of Health and Human Services going to try to intervene when Georgia's trying to, again, just to pick Georgia as a state, could be Indiana, could be Texas, could be wherever, when a state says, no, our children are going to be protected, they should not be experimented on, they shouldn't be exposed to these kind of transgender hormonal therapies. When Minnesota says we're going to do it anyway, we've seen a lot of federal courts in the last couple of years doing these weird intervening pauses and holds and releases. So it's like, it doesn't really matter what a state passes as far as the law anymore, if the federal courts can just come in and snap their fingers and pause something.
Yeah. let's look at their history here. So you can take the Biden-Harris administration. Time and time again, they've been challenging the laws in Tennessee, the laws in other states, protecting kids from these gender transition drugs and surgeries. They've had a pattern and practice of going after these states with everything that they've got to try and stop these states that are just saying, we shouldn't be putting our kids on puberty blockers. We shouldn't be doing these irreversible surgeries to them. And then you look at Tim Walz when he was governor of Minnesota, again, pushing an executive order, just like you were talking about, using that executive branch authority to say, we're going to make Minnesota a place where we are going to give kids, where we're making it our state policy that kids ought to have access to these dangerous drugs and surgeries. The very ones that Europe is saying these are harmful, they're actually causing higher suicide rates. And Tim Walz made it the policy of Minnesota to say, come here, kids, and we're going to give you access to those. That is a dangerous history that we've seen play out and one we all ought to be concerned about moving forward.
So if we're actually taking a look at functional policy moving forward, how do we move states in the direction of protecting their sovereign rights? Obviously, the presidential election is a huge component of that. Obviously, keeping individuals like Tim Walz and his governorship style, his gubernatorial procedures in Minnesota out of the White House and out of the executive suites, that's a very important thing. But beyond that, there has to be something more, right? We want to be moving towards a better policy. Is there a constitutional amendment that needs to be proposed so that we look at how states can and can't inflict legislative policy on each other? How do we make this a non-issue in the next couple of decades? I want a long-term solution here.
Yeah, well, I think there's some things that are already happening. We're seeing state after state step up against the federal government, against these actions. So whether it's states standing up to defend their laws protecting women's sports or protecting kids from gender transition drugs and surgeries, or the 20 plus states that have filed lawsuits against the Biden-Harris administration's rewriting of Title IX so that sex no longer means male and female, it means gender identity. So we're seeing states band together and say, we've got to put a stop to this. Anytime the federal government is overreaching, anytime it is trying to interfere with what we as a state have decided is best for our citizens, anytime it interferes with our ability to protect kids from dangerous gender ideology, we're going to push back and sue. And largely, we're seeing great successes on that. The courts ruling for states, even the Supreme Court letting Tennessee and Kentucky's law protecting kids from gender transition remain in effect. So I'm encouraged by what we're seeing there. But I think we do have some of these other safeguards. You know, the Constitution protects states' rights, and I think we've just got to more and more assert those. And any time the federal government oversteps, especially when we're dealing with vulnerable kids, especially when we see federal policy pushing kids towards gender ideology, we've got to have states, families, and others stepping up and saying, not on our watch, federal government, back off and let us protect our kids in our home state.
In the meantime, when we're waiting on some of those things to be reinforced, further set into stone, when we're waiting to see the results of those movements, how is Alliance Defending Freedom working to make sure that there aren't rights lost in the interim or maybe in the temporary?
Well, that's one of the reasons we've been filing all of these lawsuits. So we've joined with several states in filing 5 different lawsuits against the Biden and Harris administration's rewrite of Title IX. And we've had victories in all 5 of those cases. Courts giving injunctions to the states and to our clients at Alliance Defending Freedom, clients that include female athletes, that include teachers and others that don't want to be forced to use inaccurate names and pronouns. We're fighting against it and we're winning. And it's the same reason we're also standing with states like West Virginia as we're defending their Save Women's Sports Act at the U.S. Supreme Court, hoping the court will take that up and make sure that the laws of West Virginia and the 24 other states can remain in effect. Every time we're seeing these, we're standing with female athletes, with parents, with educators and others pushing back against the Biden-Harris administration because we are not going to let them harm our kids and push this gender ideology in public schools and families and hospitals and doctors. We're going to protect our kids.
Absolutely. Matt Sharp, Senior Counsel over at Alliance Defending Freedom. Check him out over at adflegal.org. Follow some of the cases that they're working on. Incredibly important to not only parental rights, but the rights of individuals in general here in the United States. Matt, thanks for hopping on.
Thanks, Tony.